Okay, recording is underway. Welcome again, everyone, to Phoenixville Public Library's online presentation of a brief history of the Delaware and Hudson Canal, presented by Phoenixville Library's own Walter Hook. Welcome, everyone. We'll be taking questions after Walter's presentation. So right now we will turn things over to Walter. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending. And we'll try to make this as interesting as possible. I told Mark earlier that when anything I present is listed as brief, those who know me know that I'm not really all that brief, but if you ask me what time it is, I could tell you how to build a clock, so to speak. So that being said, we'll try to keep this as succinct as possible, try to hit all the high points, give you some salient information, and give you the opportunity to obtain more information on the history of the Delaware and Hudson Canal, which you'll see is probably one of the premier canals in this country that led to the Industrial Revolution in this country. So that being said, let us begin. There's a quote from Washington Irving, who visited Dyberry Forks in 1841. You can all read this. I'm not going to read it for you, and you can see that he was rather impressed with the canals. The canals were, in the early part of the 19th century, the up-and-coming means of transportation. They were the 747s of the 19th century. When the interest for the Delaware and Hudson Canal began, the Erie Canal was already 2-3 years old. So the effectiveness of the canal system in this country was reaching a high point, so that there was a lot of interest in the canal, and it was a good opportunity for people to make money. Why was there a canal? Well, the Wirtz brothers in Philadelphia owned tracts of land in northeastern Pennsylvania, and those tracts of land were in the coal region. The coal there was called stone coal because it was the hard anthracite coal. Prior to the beginning of the 19th century, coal was primarily imported from England, bituminous coal, soft coal. And it was very uncommon to use the anthracite coal. Now, during the 18th century, some of this coal was floated down the Lackawanna to the Susquehanna River. The Susquehanna then flowed down to Carlisle and points south. And it was used during the anthracite coal was used during the Revolution at the Carlisle Armory to fire furnaces that were used to make weapons. But it was a very unprofitable and expensive proposition to get the coal down the Susquehanna. A couple of things were significant too, because of the fact that the market in Philadelphia, where the Wirtzes lived, wasn't a very open market at that point. People preferred to burn wood as compared to burning coal. And the plentiful supply of wood in the region prevented any extensive use or interest in coal. However, that, coupled with the expensive and the difficulties of shipping the coal to Philadelphia, even if there had been an interest, was rather unattractive. So therefore, the Wirtz brothers turned their interest toward New York City. And William Wirtz had done a lot of meandering, taken rambles through the area of northeastern Pennsylvania, and he was familiar with the area along the Delaware River, where the Lackawaxen River enters the Delaware, where in prehistoric times, the valley between that and the Hudson River was an open stream, an open river, so that he was very familiar with the valley that lay between the Hudson River and the Delaware River. So he envisioned the possibility of shipping coal from the anthracite region down the Lackawaxen to the Delaware, crossing the Delaware, and subsequently with a series of interests in building a canal, shipping it over to Rondout or Kingston, New York, and then subsequently shipping it on down through to New York City. And it was in 1818 that Maurice wrote to Colonel Seeley in Wayne County, Pennsylvania, inquiring about a turnpike road that was planned to extend over the Music Mountain at Ricks's Gap, and subsequently being able to use that highway to wagon load coal over the Music Mountain to the Lackawaxen and subsequently ship it on down by barge or other transportation means at that point, water transportation means, to the Delaware and other points. Piqued his interest because of the existence of the Erie Canal at that point in time. He had contacted the engineer, chief engineer Benjamin Wright, chief engineer of the Erie Canal, and asked him to perform a survey of the region so that they could determine the feasibility of actually developing a canal, having a canal go from Byberry Forks to the Delaware, across the Delaware, and then over the mountains to Rondout, New York, in Sullivan County. Unfortunately, Wright wasn't able to do that, so he had sent two of his assistants, John B. Mills and Edward Sullivan, to do surveying. And they prepared a map. And this map was very significant because it did show the feasibility of such a inland waterway, such a canal, would be a feasible opportunity for being able to ship coal to New York. However, there's a little bit of a problem. There's still not a significant market. And the important thing is, in order to procure the resources, they had to also obtain permission and allowance from the states, both Pennsylvania and New York, to build a canal. So one of the Wirtz brothers, John, interceded with the Pennsylvania legislature, and in 1823, in April of 1823, or I'm sorry, in March of 1823, had procured rights from Pennsylvania to expand and to use the Lackawaxen River as a suitable waterway to ship coal to the region of the Delaware. In March of the same year, New York granted permission and authorized the formation of the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company. Now, this reiterates why the confluence of the Lackawaxen and the Dyberry Creek was chosen. It was one of the nearest points to the major sites of anthracite mining. And it was at Ricks's, at the Dyberry Forks, 16 miles on the other side of the Music Mountain, which again, mountains posed a problem to getting anything to the rivers. And we'll talk about why and how that was overcome. Now, one of the other issues was the possibility of developing a canal didn't meet with opposition from the people along the route of the canal. One of the reasons was that it was more expensive to ship an item than the actual cost of any item that would be shipped inland. So it opened up new markets, both coming and going, allowing the material that was produced on one part of the canal or the one part of the states to be shipped to the other part, and subsequently with reducing the costs. Later I'll show a slide that gives some of the basic prices for transshipments. From that location at Dyeberry Forks, it was reasoned that passage across the river would be a very feasible opportunity. Now, in the beginning, as I indicated, the states had to provide the authorization. They provided the legal framework for establishing the canal. And subsequent to that, the Morse brothers performed a little marketing. As I had indicated earlier, the map that was prepared by by Benjamin Wright's associates stimulated a lot of interest in financial areas of both Philadelphia and in New York. Now, one of the issues was that there still wasn't that great a market in New York City for coal. However, the Woods brothers went to the Tontine Coffee House down by Wall Street in New York. And that was in December of 1824. And they conducted a fire burning experiment. They displayed a fine burning quality that was exhibited by the anthracite coal. The fact that it wasn't as smoky and as dirty as the bituminous coal was. It was essentially plentiful, and with their assistance, could be easily brought into New York City. So they offered shares, and it was amazing because the stock of the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, which was formed, which was in existence at that point in time, was offered for sale on January 7th, 1825. And by 2 p.m., all the stock had been sold out. Now, it's interesting because one of the individuals who was involved with purchasing significant amounts of shares and who had significant influence at that point in time was Philip Hone. And Philip Hone was yet to become the mayor of New York City. However, he was a well-regarded socialite in New York City. He was friends with Martin Van Buren, John Quincy Adams, and Washington Irving, Samuel Morse, Daniel Webster. All these were associates of Hone. So he had a fair amount of influence. And because of his influence and the fact that he had made a fair amount of money in merchandising and in the auction business, he was elected the first president of the D&H Canal. And subsequently, as a result of the finances being established or obtained for the production of the canal, work began. In 1825, July 13th of 1825, after all the authorizations and funds and surveys had been completed, 2,500 workmen started working with 200 teams of draft horses. They were employed through the spring of 1826. Now, one of the misconceptions or conceptions regarding the building of the canal is that people started at one end and kept digging until they got to the other end. Unfortunately, well, it wasn't quite true with the Delaware and Hudson Canal. There were different teams working at different locations along the prospective path of the canal. And as a result, these, because of the surveying and because of good engineering, were able to link up ultimately to form the entire distance of the canal, 108 miles in total. Now, many of the workers who were digging the ditch, so to speak, and providing the work were Irish immigrants. They often fought with the lumbermen along the trail. They often fought with the rafters. They often fought among themselves, and they subsequently obtained the reputation of being the wild Irish. The average worker was paid $12 to $14 a month. And one of the other considerations that led to why the people were called the wild Irish was the availability of whiskey, cheap whiskey at 50 cents a gallon, so that a considerable amount could be consumed, and we all know the ramifications of that. Now, this is a map. I'll leave it on the screen for a moment. It's of minimal significance as far as the presentation goes. It just shows the relative locations of sites along the canal and the ultimate destination of the Hudson River. Here's another. Now, this shows a delineation between the boundary of Pennsylvania and New York, which happens to be the Delaware River in the northeastern part of the state. When the canal was first built, it traversed land through Pennsylvania up to the Delaware River. However, there was no definitive way of getting boats across the river other than floating them across, pulling them across, ferrying them across to the other side in New York State, where they would be re-entering the canal and then on their way to Kingston and the Hudson. So the D&H Canal Company hired John Roebling, and you'll know that John Roebling is the engineer who was responsible for building the Brooklyn Bridge. Well, one of Roebling's major accomplishments as he was working with Wright and the others at the D&H was that he designed several viaducts. And these aqueducts were used to ferry boats across the wide expanses of the river. Now, let me back up a moment. We've talked about the canal. I'll give you some basic information regarding the dimensions of the canal. When it was first built and when the first traffic went on the canal, the first canal boats, which were called flickers, in 1828, the canal was 4 feet deep, 20 feet wide at the bottom and 32 feet wide at the top. So two boats could pass side by side, because the average boat was 14 feet in berth or girth. In 1839, finally a full head of water could be put into the 4 foot deep canal. Obviously, if anyone has ever tried to build a pond or a pool in your backyard, and I know as a kid I had tried this several times, digging a hole, pouring water into it, and expecting to see a little bit of a pond develop. It didn't happen. The water seeps through the edges and the sides. So there has to be something to keep the water as a full head in that pond. So it wasn't until 11 years later that a full head of water was obtained in the canal, and that was at 4 feet. So the depth of the canal and the girth of the canal, the boats, was somewhat limited. The early boats could carry maybe 10 tons of coal, whereas the older boats, or the older, I mean, I should be saying the newer boats, those toward the end of the canal's lifespan, were carrying significantly more, 100 tons. In 1841, the depth was increased to 5 feet, but again, with increasing the depth, the canal was not fully stabilized, and various measures were taken to stabilize the canal on through to the end of its lifespan. And it was stabilized by using clay soil, clay padding, packing, actually developing or building stone walls along the edge of the canal, so that it was much easier and much better for the water to be kept in the canal. The typical canal boat was 90 feet long, again, 14 feet wide, and some of the boats had a carrying capacity of 40 to 45 tons. Others, near the end of their lifespan of the canal, were at 48 to 50 tons. Now, put a note in there that the actual amount carried at 10 tons because of the bed of the canal hadn't been stabilized for a full head of water at that point. Now, the first load of coal that reached Rondout was on December 5th, 1828, 11 boats. Now, there were a considerable number of canal boats that were built through the canal's lifespan, but on December 5th, 1828, 11 boats, each with 10 tons of coal, arrived at Rondout. The coal that was had been transported to Honesdale, or as it was known earlier as Dyberry Forks, over the Music Mountain, hauled over the Music Mountain to the canal, dumped, and then moved by wheelbarrow to the canal boats, loaded on the canal boats. The canal boats subsequently floated to, or were towed and floated to the Delaware, perilously crossed the Delaware, which was good for the mule teams and the horses that were pulling the canal boats because they were actually ferried across the river. They didn't have to swim. And the realization that there was a need for a better means of transportation to get the coal, and any significant amount of coal, because the market was increasing, to get any significant amount of coal to New York, a better means of transportation was needed to haul the coal from the coal region over the Music Mountains into the Dyberry Forks Canal terminus. And at that point, Benjamin Wright, again, the chief engineer for the Delaware and Hudson, and who had been the engineer for the Erie Canal, realized it was necessary for a gravity railroad. At this point in time, there were no steam locomotives. Steam engines existed, but not as locomotives. The D&H Canal, this is a picture of the D&H Canal Company office in Honesdale, Pennsylvania. And I'm going to take this opportunity to digress a little bit because the name Dyberry Forks was changed and subsequently became Honesdale. And we'll go through a little bit of the history as to why the name was changed or how it got changed. Presumably in 1827, someone sent a letter to the Dyberry Forks region, but addressed it to Holmes, as in Philip Holmes Dale. That's one of the theories. The other is perhaps that the village was named for Honesdale in honor of Philip Holmes, who had actually visited the site in 1827. We're going to jump ahead a few years and mention some other things that were of significance regarding the operation of the canal and the historical figures that traversed the canal. In 1841, July 1841, Washington Irving accompanied Philip Holmes, Henry Bervoot, and representatives of the Board of Managers of the D&H Canal to Honesdale, and they subsequently took a journey on the Gravity Railroad that was in operation at the time. I'll give you details on the Gravity Railroad as we progress a little farther down the line here. And Holmes noted that they took pleasure in very inconveniences of the small canal boat. They made their beds on the small hard planks. They ate primitively and traveled at 3 miles an hour. Can you imagine? It refers to Washington Irving as, with Irving's pen name, Jeffrey Crayon, and a rather archaic expression. Jeffrey Crayon enjoyed himself to the top of bent. I don't know what was bent, but it was just one of those colloquialisms popular at the time, apparently. So they had a jolly good time traveling 3 miles an hour on the canal. And as far as the local history of the town, a local resident, Reverend Willard Richardson, when they were taking repose at a spring in Dyeberry, the Dyeberry Forks of Dyeberry Glen. They toasted each other with spring water, and Richardson stated, as you see, Ladywood Lane, christened by the author of Knickerbocker, who will be remembered as long as an American lives, for a Dutchman smokes his pipe or drinks his beer. And Ladywood Lane subsequently became known as River Street, not one of the more popular streets in the town at this point. And Washington Irving then toasted home by saying, Honesdale, a memento to an enterprising man of an enterprising age. And Hone replied, Irving Cliff, the dignified guardian of Honesdale, made famous by the weary footsteps of one who has charmed the world with his writings. And Irving Cliff is the one natural wonder of the town. Here's a picture of it. This is a picture of the Lackawaxen River flowing toward the cliff. The cliff is in the upper part of the picture. It's a copy of a postcard I have. And at the base of the picture where the river meets the horizon, it's basically at the point where the Dyeberry Creek and the Lackawaxen River join together. And this is the point where water was used to fill the canal. From Honesdale, Hone wrote to his sister, Washington Irving wrote to his sister in Paris, and he seemed to have been enthralled with the beauty of the surrounding areas, Poconos, as they were going through on their canal ride. Now, getting back to the coal mine. This is a picture of a coal breaker. And coal that was mined was in huge blocks and chips and chunks and loaded onto cars that were dumped at the breaker. And the breaker crunched up the coal. And some of the maps of the town where the coal was deposited list at least 6 different types of coal that was used. It was all anthracite coal, but the size of the coal varied. Some of it was referred to as furnace coal. Some was grate coal, Grate. Some was called stove coal. Some was called steamer coal, probably larger blocks of coal that would be used in the steam engine on ships. Egg coal and chestnut coal. Years later, some of the coal was broken into other sizes and referred to as pea coal, chestnut, and so forth. So that the size of the coal gave names to, or it was named based on its particular size and its appearance. But it was all anthracite coal. Here you can see the lineup of cars that are going to go on the gravity once the coal is cracked and broken. Now, it was necessary to get the coal from the coal region to Honesdale so it could be loaded onto the canal boats, because Honesdale was the far western terminus of the Delaware and Hudson Canal. That was the point where the coal was to be loaded, and that's where all the action was essentially taking place. So there were 5 planes rising 863 feet from Carbondale over the summit of the Music Mountain at Rix's Gap in the Music Mountains. And then there were subsequently reported as 3 planes that descended another 950 feet into Honesdale. Originally on the Gravity Railroad, it was necessary to have turnouts so that the way it was situated was that it was a narrow gauge railroad, not the 4 feet, 8.5 inches that are currently now the standard gauge for railroads, but there were narrow gauge roads, and they initially were nothing more than planking on which were fastened steel strips, iron strips. The iron strip was the rail, and the wooden planking, if you can envision a 2x4 perhaps, with a steel strip fastened to it. That was the rail that was used for the cars initially. Now, I'll give you some more details on that as we go along. But anyway, the Gravity Railroad had turnouts so that as the cars were being, series of cars was being pulled up the hill, the loaded cars could be dropped lower down the hill. And steam engines were used, not locomotives. Again, no locomotives at this point in time. We'll talk about the first locomotive that did turn wheels, though, in relation to this. So that the narrow gauge road was based on wood. The ties or the risers were, again, wooden blocks that were perpendicular to the rails, somewhat similar to the way the arrangements are now with the railroads. But there had to be turnouts, and in bringing the cars down, they were fastened to a chain. A chain was then attached to a drum that would unroll, and as it unrolled, it would allow the cars to descend the plane to the next level. Now, as it got to the bottom of the plane, there was also a counterbalance of the empty cars being pulled up. So initially, they would have 5 empties and 5 full cars going down the plane, down the hill, which is the plane, going down the hill, and counterbalancing that were the 5 other cars that were going the opposite direction, ascending and descending simultaneously. Chains were a nice thought, but unfortunately they had a tendency to break. There were blacksmith shops all along the gravity so that they could be repaired. And that idea soon wore out because of the expense and the inconvenience and the hazard of having broken chains and cars tumbling. Accidents were not uncommon and deaths were common. So that there were some serious considerations given to a better mode of transporting the cars up and down the plains, so that the next option was rope, hemp rope, that was 7 inches in circumference. This was a rather large, heavy rope. Downside to that is if it got wet, it would be slippery, and that really wasn't a very good option either. Then they lighted upon the idea of using steel cable, and the steel cable was again produced by John Roebling. Before the fuller use of a steam engine to turn the wheel or the barrel that drew the cable, horses were used to haul the cars up and down the hill. Well, down the plane really wasn't much of a significance. Somebody could ride the car and actually put the braking on as it got down to the bottom of the plane. To give you a better idea, perhaps, if you're not familiar with the concept of the planes and the levels, just envision a series of steps, stair steps, where on one side you go down, there's a level, gravity pulls the car down to the next plane, and then it's fastened to cables or some other means of transportation to lower it safely down to the next level, over, down again another plane. On the way up, they're fastened to a chain, or the rope or the cable is fastened to the car. Cars are hauled up the plane, go on the level, or either pulled across by horses or, again, gravity, because eventually we had one way up and one way down. So that the next plane up, cars were again fastened to whatever motive form they had at that point in time and hauled up to the next level and allowed to traverse that level. by the 1850s, the railroad was using steel cables. Now, in 1858, they converted to what we now know as a T-rail, rails similar to those that we now have with our railroad system. This is a photograph that was taken in 1878, and it shows the terminus at Honesdale. And it shows a site where both the passengers and the coal are being, I'll use the term, deposited. These are the coal pockets where the coal is loaded onto the canal boats. There's a canal boat over the corner here. Here's a passenger car. Here's another passenger car. They're rather comfortable cars. The seats were rather comfortable. And here we have people sitting outside on the open deck. It's something like some of the amusement park rides that we have now, but a little bit more, we'll say, thrilling and adventurous, and maybe fraught with a little more hazard than what we would encounter, hopefully, now. This is a picture of the canal boats queued up, and here are the bins where the coal coming out. These are the cars, these are the coal cars. These are the bins where it's being loaded into the holes on the canal boats. And the canal boats had a deck and a deck house. In some situations, even the family would ride on the canal boat. So I'll show some photographs as we progress a little bit farther. But you can see that there were a fair number of canal boats. The next photograph is a little bit more telling. You can see this. I had originally thought on this photograph that all this was just faulty photography or poor quality or fading of the picture, but it's actually coal dust. So it wasn't necessarily only the miners who were being subjected to the possibility of black lung disease. The people who worked on the canal boats got their fair share of coal dust also. But this is pretty much what it looked like when the coal was being loaded from the bin down onto the folds of the canal boats. And I mentioned that Roebling had built several viaducts. This is one that's still in existence. It was brought into use on April 26, 1849, when the canal first opened for the season. Now, the canal wasn't a 365-day of the year operation, obviously. Perhaps ended in November, December if we had a mild winter, and opened again in April after all the ice and the frost had cleared. So even though it was state-of-the-art transportation up to that point, it still wasn't perfect, but I digress. This is a picture of Roebling's aqueduct. It's still in existence, and after the canal closed, ceased operation, was turned into a highway bridge. And I remember as a kid, my dad driving across this from New York State into Lackawaxen. Lackawaxen's on the Pennsylvania side. Neversink is on the New York side. This is a good aerial view of the aqueduct. Excuse me. And here we have a situation where a canal boat has just crossed the aqueduct. This necessitated not having to ford the Delaware River. Why, you're probably thinking, why run a canal parallel to a river? And not necessarily the Delaware River in this case, but the Lackawaxen River, because it did follow the Lackawaxen River. because of the uncertainty of the water level in the river. In times of flood, in times of drought, the river reacted, but because of the canal, feeders had to be constructed. So streams and creeks were dammed, creating ponds that would allow feeder water into the canal. So the canal essentially could maintain a relatively stable height, barring what I had mentioned earlier about it's not being stabilized completely, but once it was stabilized, the depth of the canal could be maintained much better than the river. Also, the current in the river would cause a problem for the boats being towed. So anyway, here we have a picture of a canal boat. Canal boats being drawn across, and this is called the Towpath. And we have the team pulling the boat. Now, children, boys and girls both, were the people who led the animals, the towing animals along the towpath. Also want to mention that even though the foundation of the canal was more for, the founding was more for the transport and sale of coal, it also allowed the transport of other materials. In this particular case, the canal boat is being loaded with lumber, and a fair amount of timber was transported via the canal, along with other items. Honesdale was a site of the glass industry in Pennsylvania. Cut glass. Glass was being blown and cut in Honesdale, different locations. There were several manufacturers. One of the more famous was the Dorflinger Cut Glass Company, but we're not going to be talking about that tonight. This is a nice picture of the child leading the mules along the towpath. The mules were the principal animals for towing the canal boats. They were cheaper, easier to maintain, didn't eat like horses. Horses were more expensive. So that the mules were the primary motive force. Another picture of a canal boat, and as indicated, Pop is the captain, Ma's at the tiller, and children are on the towpath. These kids are kind of lucky in this particular case. In this particular picture, they're riding the animals, but in most cases, they had to be led. And the concern is, once we got across the Delaware, then what? We'll talk about coming from the east to the west in this particular instance, though, not going from Honesdale to Rondout or Kingston, but coming from Kingston to Honesdale. So beginning at the Tidewater Lock in Eddyville, boats travel the Rondout Creek for about 3 miles before entering the canal. Then the canal rose to 525 feet at Phillipsport by a series of 50 locks. We'll talk about locks in a moment, because if you can imagine 525 feet of flowing water, you're looking at quite a waterfall and something that couldn't be traversed. So locks had to be built along the canal so that the boats could be lifted or raised and dropped to the level of the canal on the opposite side of the lock. So there were a series of 50 locks. Then boats traveled 16 miles to the Neversink River before descending 58 feet with the aid of 6 more locks. But they're still not in Honesdale. Then from Butler's Falls on the Delaware, the canal rose to a level of 972 feet at the terminus of Honesdale, so that there were a total of 109 locks with a lifting range of anywhere from 8 feet to 12 feet to get to the appropriate height or depth of the canal on the opposite side of the lock. Initially, each lock was 72 feet long initially, because obviously they had to be expanded later as opposed got to the length of 90 feet. Initially, the locks were 72 feet long, 9 feet wide to accommodate the smaller 70-foot boats. Because the gravity railroad wasn't fully operational at that point in time, so therefore the amount of coal really wasn't that excessive either, that necessitated the development of larger and larger and larger canal boats, that had higher capacity. This photograph shows a canal boat approaching a lock. Won't go into the full details of how the lock operated, but on this particular lock, the gate is closed, and then what will happen is on the other side of the gate, there will be the other gate, not the one you're seeing, but the other gate. Actually, looking at the way the horses, the mules are going, I think this boat is coming toward the lock, so it's approaching the lock. So the gate that you're seeing is closed. There's another gate on the other side that is also closed. Now there's a small gate underneath that large gate. It's called the paddle gate. The paddle gate will open. The water from the feeder dam or lake or pond will then flood into this lock, raise it to the water level to the height of the canal where the boat is presently. The boat will float through the gate, and then the gates will be closed, the water will be let out, the boat will float, and it'll flow out the other gate onto the canal at a lower level. So there were 109 of these types of locks along the entire length of the canal. Okay, now going back to the gravity railroad. Here we see a series of cars that were coming. Not a lot of motive force. This is all being pulled by gravity and steam engines that are connected to those wire cables. Fair amount of coal, tons and tons of coal. Excuse me. I'm going to back up a little bit later to come back to this slide because I don't want to jump ahead too far. And for the second, third decades of the 19th century, locomotive power was a potential. And I say a potential. It wasn't widely used, but it did have potential. And excuse me. So the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company executives were aware of the possibility of potentially obtaining locomotives steam locomotives, to move their cars, the coal cars, on the levels, not on the plains, not hauling them up the hills, not hauling them down the hills, but just moving them along the plains. Because some of the plains were maybe 10, 12, 16 miles long. So the opportunity of using a locomotive instead of horsepower, or horses as horsepower, appealed to them. So they had sent a 25-year-old engineer named Horatio Allen to England to buy 4 locomotives. One locomotive was built by the Stephenson plant, and it was the pride of Newcastle. That was one. But 3 other locomotives were built at Stourbridge in England. And one of the engines at Stourbridge appealed to the artistic bent of one of the engineers, the plant, and they painted a lion's face on the front of the boiler, and it became known as a Stourbridge Lion. 2 other engines, locomotives, were the Delaware and the Hudson, appropriately named for the company. All 4 engines were shipped to the United States, and the Stourbridge Lion, this is an elderly Horatio Allen. All four were shipped to the United States and then shipped up the Hudson, put on canal boats. The Stourbridge Lion in particular was put on a canal boat and then floated to Honesdale. It was offloaded at Honesdale, and on August 8th, 1829, to the attention of a somewhat skeptical crowd, some thought it was humorous, some thought it was frightening. They had never seen a contraption like this running on rails. So on August 8th, 1829, Horatio Allen bravely fired up the engine and took off and powered the engine along the rails. And you can see, as I mentioned before, the rails were wooden boards, wooden planks with a steel strip either nailed or screwed to the surface of that wooden plank. The Stourbridge Lion proceeded at a decent speed and traveled about 2.5 miles up to Sealy's Mill, or now called Sealyville. And unfortunately, there was a low bridge across the track, and the stack of the Stourbridge Lion couldn't pass safely underneath that. So he threw the engine into reverse and rode it back to Honesdale to the cheers of the onlooking crowd, because many of the people didn't know if he would successfully make that trip. And some even feared that by going around the bend in the on the rails, the locomotive would fall off and subsequently meet with disaster, but it didn't. So he got back to Honesdale safely. Engine was intact. The downside is the rails were only designed to accommodate a 4-ton locomotive, and the Stourbridge Lion was about 7.5 to 8 tons, twice the weight. And being a good engineer, Allen realized that the rails wouldn't be able to support the weight of this locomotive. They would just deteriorate, and it would be a disaster. So the engine was subsequently removed off the rails, put in a shed. The blacksmiths in town who were working on the gravity railroad cannibalized parts of it. One of the boiler was moved, I believe, to Carbondale, where it was used on the gravity railroad. And nothing ever successfully happened after that, other than the fact that the Smithsonian became aware of the boiler and scavenged some pieces. And the boiler of the original Stourbridge Lion is at the Smithsonian Institute, somewhat reconstructed. But in 1933, the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company's engineering plant built a reproduction of the Stourbridge Lion. And they used that at the Century of Progress exhibition in the Wells Fair in Chicago and at other exhibitions. And over time, donated it to the Wayne County Historical Society in Honesdale, where it's currently on display in its own building, well, its own shelter attached to the building that was formerly the D&H office that I showed you earlier. So that was the sad situation that ended in the demise of the Stourbridge Lion. The disposal, or ultimate fate of the 3 other locomotives is somewhat in question. Some say another one of the locomotives was delivered to Honesdale. There's no record of it definitively. What happened to the others, no one really knows. They were probably just cannibalized. There may be more current research that would shed some light on that, but nothing that I'm particularly aware of. But anyway, moving right along, going backwards, know that the gravity also supported passenger travel. So passenger service between Carbondale and Honesdale was begun on April 5th of 1877. Again, like a roller coaster ride. There you see people in their typical ancient garb awaiting transport. This is another photo of the terminus at Honesdale. As I had shown you earlier, this is where the canal was. Taken sometime around 1878. You can see that the open-sided cars and two of the enclosed cars. They had plush velvet-covered seats, not uncomfortable. As a matter of fact, there's another passenger station on the Gravity. Actually, this car is called the Eclipse. It's a surviving Gravity Railroad passenger car, and that too is now housed in the Wayne County Historical Society building on Main Street in Honesdale, and it's been turned into a theater of sorts. The plush seats are still in existence. They've been modified and reupholstered, and the interior of the car is well maintained. The exterior is well maintained. It had been in its own museum on Route 6 for many, many years after it had been returned or turned over to the Historical Society, but then it was subsequently eventually moved down to the Wayne County Historical Society's building on Main Street. But it was used by the Historical Society and turned into a theater so that people could go in, enjoy the comfort of the plush seats while they watched the video that gave detailed descriptions of how the Gravity Railroad was formed and the development of rail locomotives in the United States, including the history of the Stourbridge line. With the Gravity Railroad, what we have is one way up, one way down. Just to make life a little bit easier and a little less hectic and a little bit traumatic for the passengers, so that you can see there's a double rail system. So one would be used for the light, one would be referred to as the light rail, the other would be the main rail. The light rail would be for returning cars, for those going back to the original destination. Not necessarily used in terms of the passenger cars, because the passenger cars could be carrying passengers both to and from the locales. But the empty coal cars going back across Music Mountain to Carbondale to be loaded into Oliphant and Archbold and those locations went on what was called the light rail. So it's another picture, not necessarily of Honesdale, but it shows the complexity of the rail systems that were used and the amounts of coal that were being transported. This perhaps gives a good picture of what it was like on the plains. I believe this is a picture of Gravity Railroad at Moxham, Pennsylvania, not necessarily part of the D&H Gravity Railroad, but you can see there are two ways. It's a double lane gravity. This is the top of the mountain, and this is the bottom of the mountain. And by fastening the cable to the car would then be hauled up. The tandem and simultaneous movement of cars up and down the hill wasn't something that would be absolutely necessary with this type of arrangement with the two rails. So you can see the way that things have progressed. This is another view of the car loaded with passengers ready to go up the hill. Now, tons and tons of coal were deposited along the Hudson River. You can see the canal boats all lined up, and you can see the respective coal piles. Coal was then loaded onto steamers, and the steamers then hauled the coal on down Hudson to New York City to awaiting markets. What I should mention is that the The New York market was a little more exclusive for the D&H also. One, because the company was chartered through New York State initially, but also because there was less competition. I mentioned that the people of Philadelphia preferred to burn wood as opposed to coal, although they did use coal, but if the Delaware and Hudson had shipped it to Philadelphia, they would have been in competition with other coal companies, the Schuylkill Coal Company, and let me see if I have the name of the other. No, I don't know that, but there was competition. Oh, the Lehigh Valley Coal Company. And so not only was there an advantage to going to New York where they could corner the market, so to speak, but they didn't have the competition, so that they were a little bit better off than if they had tried to go to Philadelphia and populate that market. Here's an overview, the volume of coal that was shipped on the D&H Canal. In the first year of operation, well, I'll back up, I'll reiterate. In 1828, the first load, 11 10-ton canal boats arrived at Rondout, 110 tons, and that was just the beginning. In 1829, in the first year of operation, 7,000 tons of coal were delivered. In 1830, 43,000 tons at $16,422.44 worth of tolls. 1839, we see an increase, 192,000 tons. 1866 was up to 1,391,000 tons. And the peak year was 1883, peak tonnage year. 4 million tons of coal were transported. Now, how did that coal get there? Again, gravity railroad over the mountains, onto the canal boats. Canal boats across the Delaware, over the aqueducts, onto Rondout, offloaded along the Hudson and steamered down to New York. A considerable endeavor, but rather profitable. Now, we're running into a situation. After 1883, that was the peak year. We start to run into competition. Another coal company is formed, and it's called the Pennsylvania Coal Company, and they're transshipping coal from the coal region, from the properties that they own, over the mountains, 47 miles now. The Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad covered a distance of 16 miles coming to Honesdale. If you were going from Honesdale to Carbondale on the gravity, it was 20 miles because of the circuitous and added distance of additional trackage that circumvented the coal line. But anyway, the competition was then transshipping coal from the area around Pittston, Pennsylvania, 47 miles to Hawley, and then loaded onto canal boats, most likely D&H, and using the D&H Canal to, again, move the coal down to the Hudson River. Another incursion. By 1883, we all know that steam locomotives and better transportation railroads were in effect and being built, so that the D&H was experiencing competition from the Erie Railroad. Over time, the Delaware and Hudson did develop, have a railroad that went through the valley from Carbondale to Honesdale on through to New York. That was circumvented by the Erie, which took over that line, so that transshipping then went by coal car on steam locomotives, pulled by steam locomotives, higher volume cars, more tonnage could be loaded onto those cars. Bigger trains, longer trains, mile-long trains would then haul the coal from the coal region to whatever the destination was. By that time, the market for coal had blown up extremely well for the people who own the mines, because the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Many areas needed coal at this point, used for smelting iron, used in the iron industry, used in home heating, much better than wood-burning fireplaces. Indoor plumbing was starting to become popular. Indoor heating was becoming a trend, so that there were a lot of factors that fueled the development and the market for anthracite coal, but were essentially spelling the defeat or the demise of the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company. During this duration, the Delaware and Hudson became a railroad also, with locomotives of its own. We'll talk a little bit about the end of the canal and gravity. The canal ceased operations in December of 1898, and it also signaled the demise of the gravity railroad. As a young man, I had the privilege of meeting and knowing and having friendship through the family with a gentleman by the name of Henry Soddy. And Mr. Soddy was quite the historian, and he was rather proud of the fact that as a youngster, he rode the last canal boat that left on the D&H Canal to Rondout. And he spoke very frequently about his experiences on that trip. And as an aside, in his house, he also had a ticker tape machine that was part of the Black Tuesday, beginning of the Great Depression, that spewed out ticker tape that was signaling the advent of the Depression. So anyway, in 1899, in January 3rd, 1899, the Gravity Railroad ceased operations. Now, a proposal was floated to keep the gravity in operation for passenger travel, because there had been a observation post and park at the top of the Music Mountains, so that the passengers could exit the cars and have picnics and stroll through the grounds, but didn't meet with much enthusiasm, and it fell into disuse and never got anywhere. Excuse me. With the demise of the Gravity Railroad, 5,000 coal cars were burned. Some of them were probably scavenged, the wood scavenged, but the historical records indicate that they were burned. And 199 boatmen were unemployed. I mentioned earlier that I would give you an overview of what the freight rates were. Per ton per mile. In 1831, 1 ton of salt cost 2.5 cents per mile to ship on the canal. Liquor, molasses, sugar, 1 cent per mile. General merchandise, 3 cents per mile. Ground tanner's bark, which was produced in the Poconos, was shipped. Was used for tanning hides and the leather industry. That was 2 cents. There were various rates. It's noted that at no time did the company's revenue for commodities exceed $50,000 per year. My apologies, it's not $50, but $50,000. There's zero missing. And several times I've tried to have the computer put it in and it refuses to take the other zero. But anyway, coal was essentially the cash cow for the canal. Now, what I would like to do is talk about the reinvention of the Delaware and Hudson. It had become a railroad, and even though the gravity and the canal were passing into history, they did form a suitable railroad. It was a large functioning railroad, passenger traffic, freight traffic. However, in the 1970s, because of competition from other railroads, Canadian Pacific in particular, it became a bridge line. Bridge line meaning that it served as a conduit between one major railroad company to another major railroad company at a different location, essentially shorter distances. And it ultimately did cease operations, but that's a whole different story. Now, what I'm going to show you is this is one of the Alco locomotives that was used on the Delaware and Hudson as a functioning railroad. In the 1970s, the company made a historic history anniversary train run. This is around 1979, I believe, an anniversary train. One of the big Alco locomotives is pulling the train. You can see observation car, and then on the back of the behind that is a reproduction. It's the Stourbridge lion that's now on display at the Historical Society in Honesdale. And then I don't know what was contained in the rest of these, but that was basically what had happened. Now, I also wanted to pass this by anybody who is interested. If anyone would like to make a donation to the library, I have 3 1945 editions of the Delaware and Hudson Canal history. It was written by Edwin Leroy, and it's probably one of the definitive works on the history of the Delaware and Hudson Canal. It gives an overview of the gravity railroad and the development of the Stourbridge Lion as a means of transportation. I have 3 copies of that I've acquired through my family, and I will offer those to anybody who would make anybody who makes a single $25 donation to the library. Each individual then would receive one of those 3 books. I also have a copy of the reproduction of Illustrated Wayne County editions 1900 and 1902. And it's a larger book, and it gives a history of Wayne County, the development of the gravity, the history of the county itself, the reiteration of the glass works, actually, which were still in operation at that point in time. And it's a rather interesting historic perspective. I would offer that to anyone who would make a $50 donation to the library. And I had pictures that somehow got there. This is the Illustrated Wayne. That was a reprint that was produced by the Wayne County Historical Society. And these are the copies of the Delaware and Hudson Canal history. So for a $50 donation, one can be the proud owner of this text, and for $25 donations each, you can have your own copy of the Delaware and Hudson Canal history. I have to warn you though, with these books are not pristine. They are not like they just came off the publisher's shelf. So some have a little bit of wear, but they all are intact. Nothing distasteful or unsavory about any of them, other than the fact that they are good sources of reference and that they are a little bit worn and dated like the rest of us. They predate me by a couple of years. So if there are any questions, I will be glad to address that at this point in time. And thank you very much for your attention and your patience in dealing with me as I rambled on through this discussion.
It was great, Walter. Thank you. Thanks for the information, interesting information, wonderful photos too, and thanks for making the offer of the books as for donations to the library. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourselves, or you can ask your question in the chat feature. To unmute yourselves, you can hold your finger on the space bar or go up to the top right corner of your video screen and select unmute from the menu there.
Yeah, I have a question for Walter.
Yes.
Were there any dams or dam pools built along on the Waxen River as part of the canal system?
To the best of my knowledge, no. That doesn't mean that there wasn't a possibility, but no, the river was essentially kept as free flowing because initially, as mentioned, there were problems with the raftsmen. The raftsmen would float their items down the Lackawaxen to the Delaware, down the Delaware to Philadelphia, so that the transport on the river was essentially to be left unencumbered by any damming or any blockages. Now, I do have to admit that there were times when the river was dammed, and not necessarily for canal purposes, but more for aesthetics. And I hope I'm not going to give someone vertigo by backing up through this, but this lake was essentially in Honesdale. It was dammed, the river was dammed down on the horizon here, right where the confluence of the Delaware and, the confluence of the Dyeberry and the Lackawaxen met. So there was a spillway and a bulkhead there. And this made this beautiful park. As a matter of fact, my parents' house was right along the side of the park here. But because of flooding and other concerns, the bulkhead was removed so that the river was free flowing, no more water fountain in the river, and the depth of the river was dredged, and it was considerably deeper now. So that if you were to go to Honesdale, stand at the site where this picture was photographed, you would look down culverts and you would see bare banks on both sides of the river and what appears to be a small stream running through. The Lackawaxen, by all means, is not a river comparable even to the headwaters of the Delaware as far as its size at this point. It gets wider as it heads down toward the Delaware, going down through the, down toward Lackawaxen, the town of Lackawaxen. I hope I answered your question.
Walter, there's a question in the chat.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it?
I can't see it.
All right, I'll read it to you. With all the traveling through the locks, et cetera, how long did it take to get from start to finish?
Okay. Let's do some fast math. Fast travel, 2 days. Slow travel, 3 days. Traveling 108 miles at 3 miles an hour. Could give you an idea of how long that that would take. So maybe a day and a half on a full speed. So 24 to 36 hours, depending. I also want to mention that sometimes there were packet boats too that would travel on the canal, that would carry passengers. And these boats would probably travel a little bit faster than the canal boats, because canal boats were weighted down. The packet boats were obviously sailboats, but the canal boats would have to be towed. So there would have to be rest stops for the animals too. So that added time to the transport across the entire distance of the canal. So it could be anywhere from 36 hours to 3 days, depending upon how fast the boat was being moved. Thank you. Good questions.
Anyone else for Walter? All right, I guess we've covered it. Thank you again,
Excellent.
Walter. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, and thanks for joining us for the presentation, everyone. And you'll be able to find a recording of this up on our YouTube channel, the library's YouTube channel, sometime next week. And hope you take Walter up on his offer to give you those books in return for a donation to the library. When you're making your donation, please be sure to reference Walter's presentation. All right, thanks so much, Walter. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night now.
Good night.